Hey guys, tonight I want you to just take a second to settle in. Maybe adjust your pillows, find that one cool spot on the bed, and just let your shoulders drop. We're going to spend a very long time together tonight, drifting through the slower, weirder lanes of history. We're moving away from the palaces and the crowns for a moment to look at a disaster that is, quite frankly, as ridiculous as it is tragic. It's the kind of thing that sounds like a folktale or a very strange dream you'd have after eating too much toast before bed, but it was very real. Tonight, we're talking about the Great Molasses Flood of 1919. Now, when we think of disasters, we usually think of fire or icebergs, or maybe a very dramatic earthquake. We don't usually think of breakfast condiments. But in the north end of Boston, on a strangely warm January day, molasses became a lethal weapon. To understand how we got to a point where a 50-foot wave of syrup was traveling down a city street at 35 miles per hour, we have to look at the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. Because, of course, this story starts with a corporation trying to make as much money as possible with as little effort as possible. The year was 1919. World War I had just ended, and Prohibition was looming on the horizon. The Purity Distilling Company, a subsidiary of USIA, was in a bit of a rush. You see, molasses can be fermented to create industrial alcohol, which was used for munitions during the war and for booze before the law stepped in. They had built this massive, towering steel tank right in the middle of a crowded working-class neighborhood. It was 50 feet tall and 90 feet wide. It was meant to hold 2.3 million gallons of molasses. But here's the thing about the tank. It was built by a man named Arthur Gell, who was the treasurer for USIA. Now, Arthur was a great guy, I'm sure, but he wasn't an engineer. He wasn't even a builder. He was an accountant. And in a move that surprises absolutely no one who has ever dealt with a corporate budget, he decided that hiring a real engineer or doing safety tests was a bit too expensive. He skipped the part where you fill the tank with water to see if it leaks. He just looked at the steel and said, "Yeah, looks fine," which is a bold strategy when you're planning to store millions of gallons of sticky brown goo in the middle of a city. From the very beginning, the tank was a disaster. It groaned, it metallically complained. Whenever it was filled, the people living nearby could hear it rumbling like a giant, angry stomach. It leaked so much molasses from the seams that local kids would come by with cups to collect the drippings. They'd just stand there, getting free snacks from a ticking time bomb. Did the company fix the leaks? Of course not. Instead, they painted the tank brown. Why? So the leaks would be harder to see. That is the 1919 version of putting a piece of tape over the check engine light. It's peak corporate laziness. And honestly, you have to admire the sheer audacity of it. On January 15, 1915, the temperature in Boston did something weird. It had been a freezing January, but suddenly the thermometer shot up to about 40 degrees. This caused the molasses inside the tank to expand. Now remember, this tank was already struggling. It was made of steel plates that were too thin, held together by rivets that were under way too much stress. It was essentially a giant, overinflated balloon made of metal and sugar. Around 12:40 p.m., the tank finally had enough. It didn't just leak, it exploded. Witnesses said they heard a sound like a machine gun, which was actually the rivets popping out of the steel at high velocity. Then came a low roar. A 2-story tall wave of molasses, thick and dark and cold, burst out of the tank. Because molasses is non-Newtonian, it behaves differently than water. It was thick, heavy, and moved with the force of a landslide. It demolished the elevated train tracks. It knocked buildings off their foundations. It was moving at 35 miles per hour. If you've ever tried to pour molasses out of a jar on a cold day, you know it's slow. But 2.3 million gallons of it moving at once? That's a wall of sludge that weighs about 12 pounds per gallon. It's a literal crushing weight. The aftermath was a nightmare in slow motion. People and horses were trapped in the sticky mess. The more they struggled, the deeper they sank, which is a terrifying thought for a Tuesday afternoon.
Rescuers struggled to get through it. They were literally sliding around in knee-deep syrup. They had to use salt water from fireboats to try and wash the gunk away, but that just turned the whole neighborhood into a giant salty puddle of brown goo. The cleanup took weeks. They used sand to soak it up. They used saws to cut through the hardened syrup. The harbor stayed brown until summer. For decades afterward, residents of the North End claimed that on hot summer days, you could still smell the faint, sweet scent of molasses rising from the pavement. It became a part of the city's DNA, a sticky, tragic reminder of what happens when you let an accountant build a skyscraper-sized vat of syrup. USIA, of course, tried to blame it on anarchists, because why admit you used thin steel when you can claim a shadowy group of terrorists blew up your sugar tank? But the court didn't buy it. It was one of the first times a major corporation was held accountable for a man-made disaster. It actually led to the creation of building codes and engineering certifications in Massachusetts. So, in a weird way, we have a giant wave of syrup to thank for the fact that our modern buildings don't just fall over because someone wanted to save a buck on rivets. But let's leave the sticky streets of Boston behind for a moment. Let's float away from the 20th century and head back to a time when disasters were a bit more royal. Let's go back to the Middle Ages, where being a royal child wasn't all crowns and ponies. It was actually a fairly high-stakes game of survival, and the odds were rarely in your favor.
So we've just navigated a rather sticky situation in 20th century Boston. Let's now drift back, way back, to a time before industrial accidents and corporate negligence, to an era where simply existing was a challenge, especially if you happened to be a tiny, crown-wearing human. We're going to talk about medieval royal children, and let me tell you, it wasn't all riding miniature ponies and having bespoke jesters. It was mostly just trying not to die. You see, in the Middle Ages, childhood mortality was not a statistic, it was an expectation. For royal families, this was particularly ironic because they had access to the best medicine, the best food, and the best anything money could buy. And yet, their children were dropping like flies, because best in the Middle Ages often meant mildly less terrible or full of leeches. Let's start with the basics. Hygiene, or rather the distinct lack thereof. Royal castles were not exactly sparkling clean environments. They were cold, drafty, damp, and often filled with animals, vermin, and the general effluvia of human existence. Imagine a toddler crawling around in a stone hall that hasn't been properly scrubbed since the last crusade. It's an immune system nightmare waiting to happen. Then there was the diet. Now, you'd think royal children would be well fed, and they were in a way, but often with rich, heavy foods that weren't exactly conducive to a delicate digestive system. Fresh fruit and vegetables were seasonal and not always prioritized. Instead, it was a lot of meat, a lot of bread, and probably a lot of wine because water quality was, let's just say, questionable. For babies, wet nurses were standard, and their health and diet directly impacted the infant, so your royal future often depended on the lactating commoner your parents hired. It's not quite as glamorous as it sounds. Diseases, of course, were the big hitters. Measles, mumps, rubella, smallpox, dysentery, whooping cough. These weren't just childhood inconveniences, they were often death sentences. A tiny prince or princess, despite being wrapped in silk and prayed over by a dozen priests, had roughly the same chance of surviving these scourges as a peasant child, sometimes even less, because their little bodies were perhaps less exposed to minor ailments that might have built some immunity. And then there were the accidents. Royal children, often left to the care of servants who might be overworked or simply not paying enough attention, could fall from horses, drown in castle moats, or get into any number of scrapes that, without modern medicine, could be fatal. Think about it. Massive stone castles, steep staircases, open fires, and minimal safety precautions. It's basically a giant historical playground built by a risk assessment team that never existed. Take the children of Edward III of England, for instance.
He and his wife, Philippa of Hainaut, had 12 children. Yes, 12, a baker's dozen almost, a surprisingly large number for the era, suggesting Philippa was a remarkably fertile woman. But out of those 12, only about half survived to adulthood. Two of their daughters, Margaret and Mary, died in their teens. Another daughter, Joan, died of the Black Death on her way to marry the King of Castile. She was just 19. Imagine being promised to a foreign king, traveling across Europe, and then just, nope, plague. It was a common occurrence. Perhaps one of the most poignant examples is the story of the princes in the Tower. Edward V and his younger brother, Richard the Duke of York. They were children, direct heirs to the throne, living in the relative safety of the Tower of London, or so they thought. Then they just vanished. Two young boys, barely into their teens. Whether they died of illness or starvation or were murdered by their uncle Richard III is still debated. But the fact that two royal boys could simply disappear and never be seen again highlights the precariousness of their existence. It's not quite, oh, little Timmy fell off his pony again, is it? And it wasn't just physical ailments. The emotional lives of these children were often a mess. They were often sent away from their parents at a very young age to be fostered by other noble families. This was done for political alliances or for education in chivalry and courtly manners, but it meant very little parental bonding. They were essentially pieces on a chessboard, married off for strategic advantage, often to people they'd never met and who were decades older than them, all while they were still practically children themselves. Take Catherine of Aragon, later Queen of England and first wife of Henry VIII. She arrived in England at 15 to marry Arthur, Prince of Wales, who was a year younger. Arthur died a few months later. Then she spent 7 years in limbo, a widow and a political pawn, before finally being married to Arthur's younger brother, Henry. That's a lot for a teenager to handle. She was essentially passed from one brother to another like a piece of furniture, all for the sake of an alliance. So when we think of medieval royalty, we often picture magnificent feasts and grand tournaments. But for the children born into that world, it was often a terrifying, short, and very uncomfortable existence. They were born into immense privilege, but also into immense vulnerability. They were precious dynastic assets, but also incredibly fragile little humans in a world that wasn't designed for delicate things. Let's take a moment here to appreciate our modern plumbing and the invention of antibiotics, because honestly, just surviving childhood back then was a major achievement. But let's not dwell too long on the sadness of medieval nurseries. Let's float forward a few centuries to a time when royal children were still vulnerable, but the adults around them were trying to solve the problem of succession with a bit more science. Or at least with a lot more doctors and very expensive treatments. We're going to talk about a royal family whose every breath was a matter of state, and whose vulnerability defined an entire era.
Part 3. The Little Boy and the Bleeding Empire. So, we've just spent some time in the drafty, slightly terrifying nurseries of the Middle Ages. But now, I want us to drift forward to the turn of the 20th century, where the stakes for a royal child weren't just about surviving the plague, they were about the survival of an entire empire. We're heading to Imperial Russia, to the gilded halls of the Winter Palace, to talk about Alexei Nikolaevich, the last Tsarevich of Russia. If there were ever a child who embodied the phrase, "heavy is the head that wears the crown," it was Alexei. But for him, the weight wasn't a metaphor. It was a literal biological time bomb. You see, Alexei was born with hemophilia. Now, in 1904, if you were a regular person with hemophilia, your life expectancy was, well, let's just say you didn't worry about retirement planning. But Alexei wasn't a regular person. He was the only son of Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra. He was the sunbeam, the miracle child they had prayed for after 4 daughters. And he was a bleeder. To understand how a tiny protein deficiency could topple an empire, we have to look back at Queen Victoria. She was the grandmother of Europe, and she was also the ultimate biological Trojan horse. She carried the gene for hemophilia and distributed it across the royal houses of Europe like a very unfortunate wedding favor. Alexandra, Alexi's mother, was Victoria's granddaughter. She brought the gene to Russia, and it landed squarely on her only son. For Alexei, a simple bump on the knee or stumble while playing wasn't just a bruise. It was an internal hemorrhage that could last for weeks, causing excruciating pain as blood pooled in his joints. Imagine being a child who isn't allowed to run, jump, or play like a normal boy because your own blood refuses to clot. He was constantly surrounded by two sailor nannies, whose entire job was to make sure the heir to the Russian Empire didn't trip over a rug. Because why have a normal childhood when you can be treated like a piece of Ming Dynasty porcelain? The tragedy of Alexei's life was that his illness was a state secret. Nicholas and Alexandra were terrified that if the Russian people knew the heir was broken, the monarchy would collapse. So they withdrew. They isolated themselves in their palace at Tsarskoye Selo. Alexandra, in her desperation and guilt, because she knew she was the one who had passed the disease to him, turned to anyone who promised a cure. And that, of course, is how we get Rasputin. You can't talk about Alexei without talking about the mad monk. Grigory Rasputin was a Siberian mystic with greasy hair, hypnotic eyes, and a legendary appetite for, well, everything. But he had one thing no doctor in Russia had. He seemed to be able to stop Alexei's bleeding. Whether it was through hypnosis or simply by telling the frantic doctors to stop giving the boy aspirin, which as we now know thins the blood, Rasputin became indispensable. To the royal family, he was a saint sent by God. To the rest of Russia, he was a dark force who was essentially running the country through his influence over the empress. It's a classic historical irony. The attempt to save a child's life ended up destroying the reputation of the throne. They were so focused on the internal bleeding of their son that they didn't notice the country was bleeding out through revolution and war. Alexei himself was a bright, sensitive kid. He reportedly once said, "When I am dead, it will not hurt anymore," which is just a lot to hear from a child. He knew he was the center of a storm he didn't ask for. He spent most of his life in bed or being carried by his nannies, watching his sisters play from a distance. He was the most pampered child in the world, and yet he was arguably the most miserable. And then 1917 happened, the Russian Revolution. The Romanovs were arrested and eventually sent to Siberia. In a weird, dark twist of fate, the revolution actually made Alexei's life a bit more normal for a while. Without the rigid etiquette of the court, he played in the snow and sat with his family. But the hemophilia didn't care about politics. Even in captivity, he suffered a massive hemorrhage that left him unable to walk. The end of Alexei's story is, of course, the basement in Ekaterinburg. In July 1918, the entire family was led downstairs and executed. It's said that because the sisters had sewn the crown jewels into their corsets, the diamonds acted as bulletproof vests, making the ordeal last much longer than intended. But Alexei, the frail boy who had survived a dozen brushes of death from a single bruise, was finally taken out by the very empire he was supposed to inherit. It's a heavy story, I know, a bit of a departure from our usual silly royals vibe. But it's a reminder that sometimes history isn't moved by great ideas or vast armies. Sometimes it's moved by a single faulty gene in a single small child. Let's take a deep breath. Let's drift away from the snowy, tragic forests of Russia. We've talked about physical hunger, genetic hunger, and the hunger for a cure. But next, I want to take you somewhere a bit more colorful. We're going to head to the sun-drenched, slightly chaotic courts of the Renaissance to look at a king who wasn't sickly or sad. In fact, he was too much of everything. Part 4. The King Who Was Too Much to Handle. So we've just come from the snowy, somber end of the Romanovs, a family that was essentially undone by their own biology. It's a bit of a heavy thought to drift off to, isn't it? So let's pivot. Let's head back to the 16th century, to an England that was vibrant, loud, and dominated by a man who was, quite literally, larger than life. We're talking about Henry VIII. Now, most people know Henry for the wives, 6 of them to be precise. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. It's the ultimate mnemonic for a man who treated marriage like a subscription service he couldn't figure out how to cancel. But tonight, I want us to look at the man behind the marriages, or rather, the man who eventually grew so large he needed a mechanical hoist to get onto his horse. In his youth, Henry was the Golden Prince. He was tall, athletic, handsome, and remarkably well-educated. He spoke multiple languages, composed music, and was a world-class jouster. He was the Renaissance ideal, a man who could write a poem about your eyes and then out-wrestle a French king in the same afternoon. But as the years went on, the Golden Prince began to tarnish. And by tarnish, I mean he became a walking medical textbook of what not to do. The turning point was a jousting accident in 1536. Henry was 44, still trying to prove he was the alpha in the room. He fell from his horse, and the horse, which was armored and heavy, fell on top of him. He was unconscious for 2 hours. Some historians think this caused a traumatic brain injury that explains his later shift into paranoia and tyranny. But the most immediate problem was his leg. He developed chronic ulcerated sores on his legs that would never heal. They were constantly oozing, painful, and to be blunt, they smelled terrible. Imagine being the most powerful man in England, a man obsessed with his own physical perfection, and having to deal with a leg that was essentially rotting while you were still using it. And then there was the weight. Because he could no longer exercise, Henry turned to his other great passion, eating. And when Henry VIII ate, he didn't just have a snack. A typical royal feast might include grilled porpoise, roasted swan, spit-fired venison, and gallon after gallon of ale and wine. By the end of his life, his waist measurement was 54 inches. He became so massive that he had to be carried around the palace in a specially designed chair, a sort of 16th century pope-mobile for a man who had decided he was his own pope. Of course, Henry's physical decline mirrored his emotional meltdown. He was obsessed with having a male heir, a Prince of Wales to secure the Tudor line. This obsession is what drove the divorces and the executions. It wasn't just about lust, it was about a deep-seated dynastic anxiety. He felt that if he didn't have a son, it was a sign of God's displeasure. And since Henry was never wrong, it clearly had to be the wives' fault. Think about the atmosphere at court during these years. It must have been like walking on eggshells made of glass. One day, you're the king's favorite, hunting with him in the forests. The next, you're being sent to the Tower because you looked at him the wrong way or mentioned that the new queen had a slightly large nose. He was a man who lived in a state of constant, itchy irritability, partly from the leg ulcers, partly from the weight, and partly from the stress of trying to reinvent the English church just so he could get a new wedding ring. And yet, despite the tyranny and the smell and the mechanical hoists, Henry remained strangely popular with his subjects. He was bluff King Hal. He was the defender of the faith, even if he changed which faith he was defending. He was a man of enormous appetites in an age that valued strength and excess. By the time he died in 1447, he was a shell of the man he had been. His last words were reportedly, "monks, monks, monks," which is a bit of a cryptic way to go out, but fitting for a man who spent his life arguing with the church. They had to build a massive, reinforced lead coffin for him. During the funeral procession, the coffin allegedly popped open because of the gases building up inside. A final, messy goodbye from a man who never did anything in moderation.
It's an ironic contrast, isn't it? The man who wanted to be the most perfect king in history ended up as a cautionary tale about the dangers of too much sugar, too much power, and a total lack of a stop button. But Henry wasn't the only Tudor who struggled with the pressures of the throne. His daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, had to navigate the wreckage he left behind. And while Elizabeth became one of England's greatest queens, her life was also defined by a very specific kind of isolation. Let's take a breath. Let's leave the heavy, velvet-draped rooms of Henry's palace. We've talked about kings who were too big for their boots and princes who were too fragile for their crowns. But now, I want to take you to a court that was less about physical size and more about the absolute crushing weight of ceremony and etiquette.